So the Oscar nominations just came out, and I can't say I'm particularly enamored with any of the choices for Best Picture. I either haven't seen the film or don't want to see the film. The three that I have seen, Roma, The Favourite and Vice, I thought were really good films, but I didn't absolutely love them in the way that I need to for a film to be put into my favourites of the year, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I've made a list on Letterboxd of my top 20 films that I watched last year, and I've picked a handful of those to talk about in this video. I'll start off with the films that were released last year that I really enjoyed, and I've also picked a few films that weren't released last year but I watched them for the first time in 2018. My favourite film of the year turned out to be a complete surprise. I went to see it because I was asked to review it for work and I had no real idea what it was about and ended up just being blown away by it. So this is American Animals, which is directed by Bart Layton. This is his first sort of fiction feature film. He's made a documentary before, which definitely shows in American Animals because the film combines documentary techniques with fictional storytelling. The film is based on a real life story about 4 university students who decided they were going to try and steal a bunch of very old and expensive books from one of their university libraries. And we know right from the beginning of the film that these 4 young men did get caught because the real people are included in the film. They are interviewed telling their side of the story, and this is interwoven amongst actors playing younger versions of themselves, acting out the story that they are telling. Obviously, because there's 4 of them, they often have conflicting ideas or conflicting memories of what actually happened, and so the film often will reenact these different versions as well, constantly playing around with the idea that we can never know anything to be 100% true because the story, even a real life story, will always be told from someone's point of view. The film stars Evan Peters and Barry Keoghan, who are both absolutely incredible. Barry Keoghan is so Irish. You can tell he's Irish from his face. His American accent is impeccable, but it was very distracting to me that I could see that he was Irish. Evan Peters I thought was amazing in a totally different way because their characters are almost polar opposites despite being best friends. The film manages to be a truly gripping heist film. You get the sort of traditional beats of a heist film. What I love most is that the entire time it is critiquing exactly why these young men thought they firstly would be able to carry off a heist, having never robbed anything before, and also why they thought they were entitled to do this. Being white privileged American men, they've had most things given to them. They've been told their whole lives that they are wonderful and that they will do great things in the world, and then they reach university and they suddenly realize that the world isn't that amazing and they aren't necessarily going to be amazing in it. Evan Peters' character in particular reminded me so much of so many boys I went to university with, constantly talking as if he was the first person in the world to ever discover that society is actually a sham. I thought the film really balanced the way that you felt sympathetic towards these characters and you didn't exactly want them to get caught, but at the same time you could see that what they were doing was incredibly wrong and entitled. It was also looking at the way we often idolize these kinds of characters. Men who feel they've been hard done by, they think they are allowed to live outside of society and break its rules at the detriment to the people around them. Adding to that, the film is really creative in its cinematography and its editing. I just found it so fascinating and enthralling, and there were so many levels to it to think about. The next film I want to talk about is The Merger. This is an Australian film created from a stage show that Australian comedian Damien Callanan created. It's about this ex-footballer called Troy Carrington who lives in a small rural town in Australia. He's not liked in the town because he's a bit of a greenie and he campaigned for the local mill to be closed down, which caused people to lose their jobs, but he gets enlisted to help save the local football team, which is being threatened to be merged with another team in a nearby town. The town is also a place where refugees come to live in Australia for the first time, and Troy decides that the only way that they can save the football team is to enlist those refugees to come and learn how to play AFL. On the surface, this is a film I would absolutely not like because I have no interest in sport, but it's really not about the sport at all. It is a film about examining toxic masculinity and also looking at racism in Australia, and surprisingly manages to be not too preachy. I think the humour in this is able to balance that out really well, and also because it's not a good versus evil kind of situation. All the characters are given nuances and backstories, and you end up understanding why every single character is the way they are, even the ones that are kind of repulsive at the beginning. It's exactly the kind of film that Australians need to be watching right now, and this is just a lovely, heartwarming story about a bunch of men working out how to be friends with each other and to get rid of their toxic masculinity, and also about a town learning to accept and love the refugees that have come to live there. The last film I want to mention that came out last year is Set It Up. I'm sure anyone who has Netflix has heard of this. It's one of Netflix's rom-coms out of the several that they released last year. And this is the more adult-orientated one, starring Zoe Douche and Glenn Powell. They play assistants to two very demanding bosses, and they become friends and work out that if they could get their bosses to fall in love with each other, then they would be working less, and therefore Harper and Charlie, the two characters, would actually be able to get some time off. Of course, stuff ensues to make sure that Harper and Charlie eventually fall in love themselves. I am very picky about rom-coms. I don't like a lot of them because I find the characters often truly unbelievable, and I often find the romance really unbelievable. That whole love at first sight thing just does not go down with me. I don't think it's a real thing, and it just annoys me. Which is why I like this, because it is two characters who begin as friends and end up realizing that their friendship is something more. It definitely feels like it was very inspired by the rom-coms of the 1940s. It's very fast-paced and witty in its dialogue, and everyone in it is very funny and very characterful. I really especially loved Lucy Liu as Harper's boss, and I really loved Harper. I felt like she was one of the most normal female characters I've ever seen in a rom-com, who wore normal clothes and was really funny and intelligent, and also sometimes ditzy and didn't know what she was doing, and just a normal person. It was amazing that that should have been so miraculous. I also really liked how it is mentioned kind of offhand that she's never been in a relationship before, and she's 25 years old, which is how old I am, and I've also never been in a relationship. And that was just really nice that that was accepted and put there and not made a big deal of at all. So now to the films that I watched last year that didn't come out last year. Firstly, The Florida Project. This I did actually see at the cinema probably exactly a year ago. I think I saw it last January. It was one of those films that came out in 2017 that I really wanted to see, but I hadn't managed to, so I was sort of catching up in January. This is about a young mum and her daughter living in a motel in Florida, and Mellie follows the daughter around as she makes this motel and the surrounding areas her playground. This film very much feels like director Sean Baker just kind of set up his camera and then let the actors do their thing. It feels immensely fly on the wall while also being incredibly beautiful to look at. The places that he filmed in Florida are so bright and colourful, and the way they contrast between the lives that these characters live. I ended up bawling my eyes out at the end, which I kind of see as a measure of a good film. If I cry, it means I'm genuinely emotionally invested. Willem Dafoe also stars as the only kind of, I guess, professional actor in the film, and he is amazing. You can completely ignore how scary his face looks, and he's just the nicest and sweetest man, and really funny as well. Next, I want to talk about Gremlins 2. So I watched Gremlins for the first time Christmas 2017 and just was so confused about what I was watching. Gremlins is often played on TV at Christmas time at like 7:30 when families are watching, and it's kind of billed as this family film, but it's really not. It's incredibly violent and quite scary. I definitely would have been traumatized if I'd seen it as a child, but yeah, I really enjoyed it, and it is just a great fun campy film. I was not going to watch Gremlins 2 because I just assumed it was trying to cash in on all the toys and the success of the first film, but my sister ended up watching it and she told me it was amazing, so we sat down and watched it together, and I think it genuinely is one of the greatest sequels to ever have been made. Obviously, after the success of the first film, the studio wanted the director Joe Dante and the writers to make a sequel as soon as possible. Joe Dante refused because he thought the film was perfectly fine on its own, so the studio tried to get other directors to do it and no one else wanted to touch it. So eventually, 5 years later, Joe Dante agreed to do the sequel as long as he had complete creative control, and I guess the studio was so desperate to sell more Gremlin toys that they agreed, and so created what I think of as probably the most auteur film. If you haven't seen Gremlins, it is about this very cute character called Gizmo, who's this tiny fluffy little puppet, and if you accidentally get water on him, he will multiply, and then if you feed these mogwais, as they're called, after midnight, they will turn into evil gremlins that will destroy everything. What I love about Gremlins 2 is that it completely parodies the first film. It doesn't take anything seriously, it's incredibly meta, but yet it also gives all the characters really good arcs and furthers their stories from the first film. It's just incredibly funny, it's more ridiculous and bigger and more over the top than the first film. Gizmo gets more of the action. I mean, that's really the only reason to watch Gremlins, is because Gizmo is so cute. Next on my list is I Wanna Hold Your Hand. This is actually from director and writer Robert Zemeckis, who made the Back to the Future films, and it is about a bunch of teenagers in the 60s who drive up to New York to try and meet the Beatles, who are about to play on the Ed Sullivan Show. What I love about this film is it takes was mostly a bunch of teenage girls and treats their desires and wishes and dreams with such respect. I feel like the poster and the description of this film is kind of misleading because in actual fact there's only really one of the girls who's absolutely obsessed with the Beatles in that traditional Beatlemania way. All the other characters have different reasons for wanting to go to New York. One girl wants to take a photo of them so she can sell it to a newspaper and start her journalism and photography career. And then there's also a couple of boys who come along as well. One of them is kind of like a Grease style character who hates all the Beatles and what they stand for because he thinks it's turning boys into sissies. And so in the end the film isn't actually about the Beatles or meeting the Beatles, it's about the Beatles being a catalyst for these characters to learn things about themselves. For example, the girl who's about to be married, she realizes that she doesn't actually want to get married, she's only doing it because it's what's expected of her. It's also just a wonderfully weird film in the way 70s films tend to be. It's one of those films on the surface is just bright and colourful and really fun, but it has a lot of hidden depths to it that make it really fun to watch. Next is The Apartment. This is a very famous black and white film from director Billy Wilder, and it stars Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine. Jack Lemmon is trying to get promoted at the company that he works for, and to help this happen, he lets managers and bosses in the company use his apartment for their affairs. Shirley MacLaine works as a lift operator in the building because for some reason people in those days couldn't press the buttons in the lifts by themselves. But what I loved about this film is that it has that old school black and white feel to it while also being very modern in its themes. During the 40s and 50s, films were limited because a code was created to stop them showing any kind of sex or violence or letting bad guys get away with things. And so this film was made after that code had ended and really takes advantage of that, and the way they talk about sex in such a frank way feels kind of astonishing for a film from that era. On the other hand, I sort of read Shirley MacLaine's character as having depression, and the film never uses that word out loud. It kind of explains her behaviour as being lovesick for a guy that she knows will never be in love with her. But I definitely felt like this was a cover for the film to talk about mental health in a way that probably people didn't have the words for back then. Lastly on my list is Drop Dead Gorgeous. This film stars Kirsten Dunst at the height of her sort of teenage fame. She plays a girl who wants to compete in her local beauty pageant, and the film is done in a mockumentary style, interviewing her and other people in the Minnesota town. The other contestants in the beauty pageant start dying, and Kirsten Dunst is the only one who thinks that this is suspicious and thinks that someone is out trying to kill contestants so that a certain person will win. The humour in this film is so dark. It's quite surprising for an American film, no offense to any Americans watching, but it is almost British in the way that it has such a dark sense of humour. The mockumentary style was probably quite original back in 1999 and it works really well here. It's just a highly entertaining and highly funny film that is not really critiquing beauty pageants in a way, but more critiquing the way that society views beauty pageants and their participants. So I hope there was something on that list that piqued your interest. Let me know in the comments if you've seen any of those films. I hope you have a great day and I will see you soon. Bye!